There are two kinds of ghosts, you see. The kind that rattle chains and moan in the attic. The ones from stories meant to give you a pleasant little fright. And then there is the other kind, the silent kind, the ghosts of memory. They are the heaviest. They don't haunt houses, they haunt people. They sit with you at the breakfast table. They walk beside you on a sunlit street. They are made not of vapor, but of absence. A space at the table that is never filled, a name that is never spoken. My ghost has a name. Her name is Elara. Before we get started, please let me know in the comments where you are viewing from and what time you are listening to this narration. The locations and times of day or night that these verified stories reach are of interest to us. Vermont, 1872. I was 17 years old, and my sister vanished inside the walls of the Blackwood Manor Asylum. When I returned for her, armed with nothing but a boy's desperate promise, they looked me in the eye and told me a lie so vast, so complete it threatened to swallow my own sanity. They said she was never there. To understand the ghost they made of her, you must first understand the girl. To tell you what they took, I must tell you what we had. Our world was a small one carved out of the unforgiving green mountains of Vermont. A farm of rock-strewn soil and relentless seasons. My father was a man made of the same material as the land, hard, quiet, weathered by duty. His love was not in his words, but in the straightness of his fence and the soundness of our roof. My mother was softer, a woman whose anxieties lived in the constant fluttering motion of her hands, mending, kneading, wringing. They were good people trapped by the narrowness of their world and the enormity of their fears. And then there was Elara. She was 2 years my elder. Elara was not ill, not in the way the world meant. She was different. She was an instrument tuned to a higher, finer pitch than the rest of us. Where I saw a field of green grass, Elara saw 1,000 different shades, a story in the way the wind bent each blade. Where I heard the simple chirp of a cricket, she heard a lament. She felt the world without a skin, she used to say. Our mother, in her worried whispers to the pastor's wife, called it a deep melancholy. Our father, when he would watch her stare at a sunset until the last sliver of light was gone, would just shake his head and mutter that it was Elara's way. She didn't live in the world so much as she absorbed it. She kept journals, dozens of them, but they were not filled with girlish diary entries. They were filled with the world as she saw it. Charcoal sketches of the skeletal dance of winter branches. Intricate, impossibly detailed drawings of a spider's web, beaded with dew, pressed flowers and leaves categorized not by species but by the emotion she felt when she found them. Hopeful cinquefoil, sorrowful willow. She said she could hear the sadness in our house, that the old wood held the memory of every hardship, every cold winter, every poor harvest. The floorboards didn't just creak, they groaned with the weight of it all. This sensitivity, this thin skin as she called it, was her gift. But in the small, God-fearing world of rural Vermont in 1872, a gift that cannot be understood is indistinguishable from a curse. The shift began after the winter of '71. It was a brutal one. A fever, what the doctor called lung sickness, had swept through the valley, and it had been particularly cruel to the young. We lost 7 children from our town in 3 months. Elara had known them all. She had sketched their faces in her book, trying to capture them before they faded. After the last little coffin was lowered into the frozen ground, something in her changed. The world's sorrow was no longer just something she observed. It began to seep into her. That's when the shadow man came. She never described a face or a form. It was a presence. A sudden profound drop in temperature in a sun-drenched corner of the room. a fleeting dark shape at the very edge of her vision, a feeling of being watched when she was utterly alone. At first it was infrequent. She would be helping Mother in the kitchen and would suddenly freeze, her hand hovering over the flour bin. Her eyes would dart to an empty corner. "He's here again, Elias," she would whisper, her voice tight. "He's listening." I never felt it. I would stare at the corner until my eyes burned, trying to see what she saw, feel what she felt. I saw only dust motes dancing in a sunbeam, but I believed her. I believed in her. She had never lied to me in her life. My parents, however, reacted with a terror that was colder than any shadow. To them, this was not a symptom of grief. It was a fracturing of the mind, feminine hysteria, a demonic influence. The language of the era offered them a dozen terrifying explanations, and not a single one of them was gentle. My father began to look at his own daughter with suspicion, as if she were a stranger in our home. My mother's prayers grew longer, more desperate. She began brewing foul-smelling herbal teas meant to calm the nerves, which only made Elara groggy and distant. The whispers in town were the true poison. Mrs. Gable at the general store offering my mother a pitying look and a tract on religious piety. Pastor Michaels speaking from the pulpit about the dangers of an idle and fanciful mind. Neighbors would cross the road to avoid my father. The shame was a physical thing, a heavy cloak my parents wore every day, and its weight was crushing them. That shame, I now know, became far more frightening to them than any shadow Elara saw. It was real. It had 1,000 eyes. Then the pamphlet arrived. It came with the mail tucked between a farming almanac and a letter from my aunt. It was printed on thick, expensive paper. On the front, an elegant etching of a grand Gothic building, all sharp spires and stately windows nestled in the mountains. The words were a balm to my parents' terrified souls. Blackwood Manor Asylum for the moral and mental cure. It didn't speak of madness, it spoke of rest. It didn't speak of confinement, it spoke of recovery. It spoke of a new revolutionary philosophy called moral treatment, championed by its director, the brilliant Dr. Alistair Finch. The pamphlet was filled with words like serenity, structured routine, and peaceful reflection. It promised to use sunlight, fresh air, gentle hydrotherapy, and compassionate guidance to untangle the knots in a troubled mind. It promised to restore young women afflicted with melancholy, neurasthenia, and hysteria to their families whole and happy. It promised a cure. That evening, I found my parents at the kitchen table, the pamphlet spread between them like a holy text. The lantern light caught the unshed tears in my mother's eyes. My father, his face grim, traced the etching of the building with a calloused finger. "It's a hospital, not a prison," he said, his voice low and heavy with a hope that sounded like desperation. "Dr. Finch is a man of science. He can help her. We can't." "She's just sad, Father," I pleaded, my own voice cracking. "She's grieving. The winter was hard on her. She just needs us. She needs time." "Time," my mother whispered, her hands twisting in her lap. "Elias, she speaks of shadows in the walls. She doesn't eat. The neighbors, they talk. What are we to do, pray until she wastes away to nothing?" The argument lasted for days. It was the first time I had ever truly defied my father. I told them they were letting the town's shame make their decision. I told them they were sending her away because they were afraid. They told me I was a boy, that I didn't understand the complexities of the adult world, the duties of a parent. In the end, their fear was greater than my love. The decision was made. The day we took her, the sky was a seamless, oppressive sheet of gray. Elara was silent during the entire morning. She moved with a strange, detached grace, as if she were already a ghost. She wore her best dress, a simple blue calico with a lace collar my mother had tatted. She looked like she was going to her own funeral. In the carriage, she didn't cry. She just held my hand, her fingers as cold as river stones. Her only luggage was the small satchel clutched in her other hand, containing a change of clothes and the little wooden bird I had carved for her one summer when we were children. The journey up the mountain road was 3 hours of grinding misery. The woods grew thicker, darker, the air grew colder. The farms and fields gave way to dense, ancient forest. It felt as if we were leaving the world of the living behind. Then, as we rounded the final sharp bend, Blackwood Manor came into view. The etching in the pamphlet had been an artist's lie. It had shown a stately home. What stood before us was a fortress. It was made of the same dark gray stone as the mountain itself, as if it had been birthed from it. Its windows were tall but unnervingly narrow, like the eyes of a hawk. The spires didn't reach for heaven. They stabbed at the sky. The beauty it possessed was cold, severe, and utterly without welcome. Dr. Finch met us at the massive oak doors. He was everything the pamphlet had promised, and worse. Tall, silver-haired, impeccably dressed in a fine wool suit, his smile was warm, practiced, and deeply reassuring. But his eyes were the color of a winter lake just before it freezes over. They assessed. They measured, but they did not connect. He ushered my parents into his office, leaving Elara and me in the grand, echoing entrance hall. The air was cold and sterile, smelling sharply of carbolic acid and lemon polish. It was the smell of erasure. Through the partially open door I could hear Finch's voice, a low, confident baritone. He used words I had never heard before, words that turned my sister's sadness into a clinical disease, neurasthenia, emotional contagion, a morbid fixation. He wasn't just convincing them, he was giving them a new language for their shame, a scientific language that made their decision feel not like abandonment, but like responsible medical care. When he emerged, my parents looked relieved. Broken, but relieved. He had given them absolution. He then turned his gaze on Elara, and his smile became a sterile, clinical thing. He didn't look at her like a person. He looked at her like a flawed specimen, a puzzle to be solved and corrected. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice smooth as silk, "you are in a place of healing now. We will give your mind the rest it so desperately needs. We will quiet the noise." Quiet the noise. He meant he would quiet her. Everything that made her Elara, the drawings, the sensitivity, the sorrow, that was the noise he intended to silence. They allowed me a few moments to say goodbye. We stood in a small, bare receiving room with a single high window. She was clutching the wooden bird so tightly her knuckles were white. "Promise you'll visit, Elias," she whispered, her voice finally trembling. "Don't let them forget me here, please." I pulled her into a hug, feeling the frightening bird-like fragility of her bones. "I'll come every Sunday," I said, my own voice thick and choked. "I swear it. I'll come every Sunday until the day I can take you home." It was a promise a 17-year-old boy made, a promise a man would be condemned to keep for the rest of his life. A stout nurse with a face like a closed fist led her away. I watched them walk down a long white corridor until Elara was just a small splash of blue in the distance. Then she turned a corner and was gone. The heavy oak door of the manor closed behind us with a deafening final thud. And I kept my promise. The first Sunday I rode up the mountain with a heart full of cautious hope. I found her in a clean sunlit room, though the sun was weak and watery. She said the routine was rigid, waking, meals, walks, silence, sleep, all dictated by the ringing of a bell. The nurses were firm, she said, but not unkind. She missed the sky. The windows were too high to see anything but a sliver of gray. She asked if I'd brought her journal. I hadn't thought to. I promised to bring it next time. The second Sunday, a shadow had fallen. She was paler, and there were faint bluish circles under her eyes that hadn't been there before. She seemed listless. When I asked her why, she looked away toward the high window. "The hydrotherapy," she said quietly. "It's very cold, Elias." She described being wrapped in icy sheets, of being made to sit in tubs of frigid water until her teeth chattered. Dr. Finch called it toning the nervous system. She called it torture. They had not allowed her to have her journal. It agitated her fancies, they told her. By the third Sunday, the light in her beautiful eyes had begun to dim. She was visibly thinner. She was quiet, her words slow and deliberate, as if it took a great effort to form them. She smelled faintly of laudanum. It was a common tincture, a calmative given for anxiety. It was meant to soothe, but it was stealing her from me, calming her into a waking ghost. I brought her a book of poetry by Miss Dickinson. A nurse intercepted me at the door to the visiting room. "Dr. Finch discourages external stimuli that may provoke an emotional imbalance," she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. She took the book. I found Finch in the hallway as I was leaving. I was furious. I told him my sister wasn't getting better. She was fading away. He placed a hand on my shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be paternal but felt like a vice. "My dear boy," he said, that infuriatingly placid smile fixed on his face. "The healing process is often like a fever. It must appear to get worse before it gets better. We are breaking down the old disordered pathways of the mind so that we may build new, healthy ones. You are seeing the necessary struggle. You are not seeing the eventual cure. Trust the science, son. Trust me." Trust me. The two most dangerous words in the English language. The fourth Sunday. That was the last time I saw her. The change was no longer subtle. It was horrifying. She was gaunt, her cheekbones sharp and prominent against skin that had become almost translucent. She sat hunched in her chair, a constant fine tremor in her hands. She didn't even look up when I came in. I knelt on the cold floor in front of her, taking her trembling hands in mine. They felt like a bundle of twigs. Finally, she looked at me. The terror in her eyes. It was pure, undiluted. It will be the last thing I see when I leave this earth. "Elias," she rasped, her voice a dry whisper. "He's moving me." "Moving you? Where, Elara? To a different room?" She shook her head, a frantic, jerky motion. "To the West Wing. That's what they call it. The incurables ward. It's downstairs. It's where they send the ones they give up on, the ones who don't get cured. No one comes back from there. The other girls, the nurses, they whisper about it. It's where the noise goes, not the noise in my head, Elias. Us. We are the noise." She gripped the front of my coat, her knuckles white and bloodless. "He told me I am resistant to moral treatment. He said my morbid disposition is a moral contagion to the other patients. Elias, you promised you would take me home. Take me home now. Don't leave me. He's taking me tonight." My blood ran cold. I saw a nurse watching us from the half-open door, her face a blank mask. What could I do? I was a boy. A farm boy with no power, no authority, no words that Finch and his staff would ever listen to. I tried to soothe her, my own words tasting like ash in my mouth. I told her I would speak to Father, that we would come for her first thing in the morning, that I would not let this happen. "I will be back," I said, the lie heavy on my tongue. "We will sort this, I promise." She wasn't listening. She had pulled away from me, her gaze fixed on the wall behind my head, her eyes wide with a terror I couldn't comprehend. As the nurse led me out of the room, I looked back one last time. Elara was rocking back and forth, clutching the little wooden bird to her chest like a talisman, whispering to someone only she could see. The week that followed was a living hell. I rode the horse half to death getting home and burst into the house, screaming at my father. He was shaken by my description of her, but Dr. Finch's influence was a poison that had gone too deep. He wrote a letter of inquiry instead of hitching the wagon. He told me, "We must be patient, son. We must trust the doctor's process." Patience, the abuser's greatest weapon. The following Sunday, I couldn't wait. A blizzard was forecast, but I didn't care. Before the sun was up, I took the horse and cart and started the journey alone. The air was bitingly cold and wet. Heavy snow began to fall, thick and fast, clinging to the branches and muffling the world in a strange white silence. It was as if the world was trying to bury the mountain to hide what was at its peak. When I finally arrived, Blackwood Manor was a gray specter in a whirlwind of white. I burst through the main doors, my coat covered in snow, my breath ragged. The usual nurse was gone. A new woman, younger and with a pinched, nervous face, sat at the front desk. "I'm here to see Elara Vance," I said, my voice tight. She looked down at the large, leather-bound admissions ledger, running a slender finger down the page of neat, cursive names. She frowned. She turned the page, her finger still tracing the lines. Then she turned another. "Vance, you said?" "Yes, Elara Vance. She was in room 213. She may have been moved." The young woman looked up at me, her expression a blank mask of professional confusion. "I'm sorry, sir. There's no one here by that name." I laughed, a short, sharp, incredulous sound that died in the oppressive silence of the hall. "That's not possible. I was here last Sunday, and the Sunday before that. Look again." "I have looked, sir," she said, her tone hardening with impatience. "We have no record of an Elara Vance. There is no, nor has there ever been, a patient by that name at Blackwood Manor." The world tilted. The floor seemed to drop away. "Get Dr. Finch," I demanded, my voice rising to a shout that felt thin and useless in the vast space. "Get him now." As if summoned by the very sound of his name, he appeared. He walked down the grand central staircase, his footsteps making no sound on the thick runner. He was smiling that same calm, paternal smile. "Ah, young Mr. Vance," he said smoothly, his voice a pool of calm in my rising panic. "What seems to be the trouble on this blustery morning?" "The trouble?" I was shaking with a rage so cold it felt like fear. "Your nurse is telling me my sister isn't here. I want to see her, now." Dr. Finch descended the last step and placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. His touch was like a block of ice. He looked at me, and his face was a mask of the most profound, theatrical pity I have ever witnessed. "Son," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate, conspiratorial tone, "I think you may be confused. There has been a terrible misunderstanding. Your family made an inquiry some weeks ago, it's true. I remember it well. A lovely girl. But you may recall, your father and I corresponded and you decided against admission. Your sister, she was never a patient at this institution." He said it with such unshakable confidence, such absolute authority. He held my gaze, his own eyes clear and steady. For a dizzying, terrifying second, my own mind betrayed me. Was I mad? Had I imagined it all? The 4 visits, her terror, her hand in mine? Had my own grief and fear conjured a phantom? No. The wood of the bird I carved was real. The terror in her eyes was real. My promise was real. "You're lying," I whispered, the words barely audible. "I was here. I saw her. I touched her hand." His smile tightened, the warmth vanishing completely, leaving only the cold steel beneath. "Grief can do strange things to a young mind," he said, his voice now clinical, detached. It can create false memories, vivid apparitions, a desperate wish to see a loved one again. Perhaps you should return home and rest. You are clearly unwell. He was not just denying her existence. He was trying to erase mine. He was trying to make me the mad one. He turned to the nervous young nurse. See that this young man gets back to his horse safely. The snow is getting quite deep. We wouldn't want him to get lost. And with that, he turned his back on me and walked away, his task complete. He had not just taken my sister. He had unwritten her. He had turned her into a secret I was now cursed to carry alone. I stood there, frozen, in the silent, snow-shrouded lobby of the asylum, staring at the empty space where a doctor had stood, staring at a ledger that didn't have her name. My promise a broken thing at my feet, my sister gone, not dead, not transferred, simply gone, as if she had never been born at all. A lie is a simple thing. A few words spoken into the air. But a lie of that magnitude, a lie built of stone and authority and sealed with the world's indifference, is not so simple. It is not just spoken, it is built. It's a wall. And for 50 years I have thrown myself against that wall again and again, feeling nothing but the sting of bruised knuckles and the cold, unyielding certainty of the stone. They said she was never there. They tried to make a ghost of my memory, and in doing so they made a ghost of me. I stumbled out of the asylum and into the blizzard, blinded by the swirling snow and the sheer, monstrous audacity of the lie. The ride home was a fugue state of cold and disbelief. When I burst into our farmhouse, a wild man covered in snow, my father met me at the door. Before I could even speak, he held up a piece of paper. It was a letter. The postwriter had delivered it just an hour before. The penmanship was elegant, the stationery expensive. It was from Dr. Finch. The letter was a masterpiece of preemptive deceit, a work of profound, calculated evil. Dated the day after our very first inquiry weeks earlier. It expressed Dr. Finch's professional opinion that Elara's condition was best managed at home, with family. It noted his respect for my father's wise decision to forego admission. It ended with a prayer for our family during our difficult time. He had anticipated me. He knew I would be the one weak link in his conspiracy of silence, and he had inoculated my family against my truth before I even had a chance to speak it. My father, a simple man who believed in the authority of important men with expensive handwriting, saw the letter as proof, not proof of Finch's villainy, but of my confusion, my madness. He says she was never there, Elias, my father said, his voice a strange mix of relief and sorrow. It's here, in his own hand. He's lying! I screamed, the sound raw in my throat. I was there 4 times. I saw her. I spoke to her. My mother began to weep, a low, keening sound. They looked at me as if I were the one who was sick. My grief, my frantic insistence, it only confirmed the doctor's diagnosis of me. Unwell. My own sister's disappearance was being used as the evidence of my insanity. It was a perfect diabolical circle. In the days that followed, a new silence fell over our house, thicker and more suffocating than the old one. We did not speak of the asylum. We did not speak of Dr. Finch. And we did not speak the name Elara. My parents, already broken by the town's shame, chose to believe the lie. It was easier. It was a story that had an ending, however tragic. The story of a troubled daughter who had perhaps run away, lost to the world. It was a grief they could manage. My story, the story of a monster in a suit and a girl who was buried alive behind a wall of medical jargon, was an impossible, unbearable truth. To acknowledge it would be to acknowledge their own complicity. So they chose to believe I was mistaken. I left the farm that spring. I could not live in a house of unspoken screams. I could not look at my parents without seeing their choice to abandon her twice. First to the asylum and then to the lie. I went to work. I sought out the hardest labor I could find, anything to exhaust my body so my mind would have no strength left to think. I worked in the slate quarries near Fairhaven, the crack of the hammer a poor substitute for the scream I held in my chest. I worked on the railroads, laying track that pushed ever westward. Each spike I drove a nail in the coffin of my memory. I worked in factories in the city, the roar of the machines a welcome noise that drowned out the silence of her absence. But every night, in every bleak boarding house, in every lonely rented room, Elara was there, her terrified eyes. Her last whispered words, my broken promise. I would wake in the dark, my heart pounding, convinced I could smell the carbolic acid and floor polish of that place. I began to collect stories. I became an archivist of sorrows. I spent my evenings in libraries, my one day off poring over newspapers from across the country. I read between the lines. I looked for the patterns, a small 2-line notice about an asylum fire where miraculously all the important records were lost but no staff were harmed. A legislative inquiry into patient abuse at a state hospital, quietly closed due to lack of evidence. I found stories of missing patients, always the difficult ones, the incurables, who were said to have wandered into the woods or succumbed to a sudden illness. It was a language of erasure, and I learned to speak it fluently. Blackwood Manor became my obsession, my life's dark star. It continued to operate for another 20 years, its reputation under the unimpeachable Dr. Alistair Finch only growing. He published papers on moral treatment. He gave lectures in Boston and New York. He became a celebrated man, lauded for his contributions to the new science of mental hygiene. When he died in 1893, his obituary ran 3 columns. They carved his name in stone. Then 2 years later, the news I had been waiting for came. Blackwood Manor was closing its doors. The state had built a new, larger institution, and Finch's fortress was now deemed outdated. A final newspaper article noted that most of the asylum's records were transferred to the state archives, but that some older administrative files had been regrettably destroyed in a small, contained fire shortly before the facility was shuttered. How convenient. Another precise surgical fire. Another wall. The world moved on. The Great War came and went. The century turned. I grew old. My hair thinned and turned the color of ash. My hands, once strong enough to swing a sledgehammer, now shook when I lifted a cup of tea. The fire of my obsession banked to embers. I told myself it was over, that I had failed, that I must let the ghost rest. But ghosts do not rest, and promises made by boys are debts that old men must pay. The closer I came to my own end, the louder Elara's whisper became. Don't let them forget me here. So in the spring of 1922, 50 years after I had last seen her, I went back. I took a train to the station nearest the mountain and hired a car to take me as far as the old road would allow. The rest of the way I walked. I was 70 years old and I was going to keep my promise. The forest had begun to reclaim its own. The road was barely a path. And then, through the trees, I saw it. The asylum was more honest in its decay. The pristine, deceitful facade had rotted away, and now its bones were showing. Ivy crept up the stone walls like a shroud. The roof had collapsed in sections, leaving gaping holes to the sky. The windows were black, empty sockets. It was the skeleton of some great dead beast. I stood before it, holding a canvas bag with a crowbar, a lantern, and a flask of water, and felt not fear but a grim sense of purpose. The great oak doors were swollen shut, fused to their frames by decades of damp and rot. I made my way around the side of the building, my boots crunching on fallen slate and broken glass. At the rear of the building, half hidden by overgrown briars, was a row of cellar windows. One of them, its iron grate rusted through and its glass long gone, offered a way in. The air that poured out of that dark opening. It was the smell of my nightmares, not just damp and decay and the scat of animals. It was something deeper, the sour metallic scent of old misery, a faint lingering trace of carbolic acid that had soaked into the very stones. I lowered myself through the window, my old bones protesting, and dropped into the oppressive darkness of the cellar. The beam from my lantern cut a nervous path through the gloom, illuminating thick, drooping cobwebs, mountains of rubble, and the rusted carcasses of forgotten equipment. I moved through the lower levels like a trespasser in my own past, the vast silent kitchens with their rows of cold hearths. The laundry, where I found a single petrified woman's stocking, lying in the bottom of a rusted tub. I found a set of stone stairs and made my way up to the main floor. The grand lobby where Finch had lied to my face was a scene of Gothic ruin. A thick carpet of grime and damp, dead leaves covered the marble floor. Plaster, like giant snowflakes, had fallen from the ceiling, exposing the lath beneath. The grand staircase was still there, its banister slick with moisture. My heart was a cold, heavy thing in my chest. I went directly to the admissions office. I walked straight to the spot where the desk had been, where the nurse had looked up at me with her blank eyes. The desk was gone, likely burned for firewood by vagrants. The tall shelves where the patient records would have been kept were still there, but they were empty. And they were charred black along the edges. The fire, the small, contained fire. It had been anything but. It had been precise, surgical. It had consumed the one thing I had come for. I slumped against the wall, the damp cold seeping into my coat, and felt the crushing weight of 50 years of failure. He had won. Even in death he had won. He had erased her so completely that not even a ghost of a record remained. It was over. I had come all this way for nothing. I closed my eyes, and in the darkness I heard it. Not a sound in the ruined hall, but a sound in my memory. A voice whispering frantically from across a half-century. The West Wing, where no one comes back from, where the noise goes. My eyes shot open. The incurables ward. She had told me where they were taking her. It wasn't just a turn of phrase. I stood up and looked around the decaying grandeur of the lobby. I pictured the asylum's layout in my mind, the floor plan I had obsessed over for years from old county survey maps. The building was symmetrical, a central hall, an east wing, a west wing. But I remembered something from my visits, a detail that had always seemed odd. From the outside, the west wing had always looked smaller than the east wing, shorter, as if a section of it were missing. I went back down to the cellar, my lantern held high, a new, frantic energy coursing through me. I followed the west wall, moving deeper into the foundation. The main cellar came to an end at a solid stone wall, a dead end. I ran my hand over the cold, damp stones, feeling for any irregularity, nothing. But the air was different here, colder, staler. The smell of misery was stronger. In a small alcove, half hidden behind a stack of collapsed rotten barrels, I saw it. It wasn't a door. It was a seam, a distinct rectangular section of the wall, about 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, was made of newer, rougher brickwork. The mortar was clumsy, thick, and a different color from the expertly laid stones of the original foundation. This wasn't a secret entrance meant to be opened. This was a seal. It was meant to close something off, permanently. It took me the better part of an hour, perhaps more. The crowbar was heavy, my arms weak, and my breath came in ragged gasps. Sweat and dust stung my eyes, but every time my muscles screamed and I wanted to stop, I saw her face, I heard her voice, and "Take me home now." With a final desperate heave, a section of the brickwork gave way with a groaning crack, and then a cascade of bricks and dust tumbled inwards, revealing a dark, narrow opening. The air that rushed out of that breach was not the air of a cellar. If the asylum smelled of decay, this smelled of damnation. It was a dense, suffocating, physically heavy stench of human waste and absolute despair. I covered my nose and mouth with my sleeve, held my lantern high, and stepped through the hole. I was not in a cellar anymore. I was in a hallway. But unlike the grand corridors upstairs, this one was brutally narrow. The ceiling so low I had to stoop. The walls were weeping with a black, greasy dampness. And lining both sides of the hall were doors. Heavy iron-banded wooden doors, each with a small barred slit at eye level and a simple slot near the floor, just large enough for a food tray to be pushed through. This was the West Wing. The real West Wing. It wasn't a wing at all. It was a dungeon. A secret subterranean annex where Dr. Finch's failures, his moral contagions, were interred. This was the place the noise went to die. My hand shaking, I pushed open the first door. It was ajar, its lock long since rusted away. The lantern light revealed a stone cell, no larger than a pantry. It contained only the rusted iron frame of a bed, its canvas rotted away. And on the wall, I saw scratches. Tally marks, hundreds upon hundreds of them. A calendar of lost days. Then words clawed into the plaster with a fingernail or a shard of stone. God help me. I backed out, a cold dread creeping up my spine. The next cell was the same, and the next, each one a tiny, silent monument to forgotten suffering. This wasn't a hospital. It was a tomb for the living. My legs felt weak. I had to find her. I had to know which of these rooms. I came to the last door at the very end of the hall. It was different from the others. The wood around the barred slit was splintered and broken, the damage clearly from the inside. A desperate attempt to see out, to break out. With a final surge of adrenaline, I put my shoulder to it. The rotten wood of the frame gave way with a wrenching scream of protest, and the door swung inward. The room was like the others, bare, cold, and empty. But there was something on the floor, in the very center of the cell, half buried in a thick layer of grime and filth, was a small, dark object. I knelt, my old knees cracking in protest. My trembling fingers brushed the thick dust away. It was a small bird carved from dark wood. Its surface was weathered and worn smooth, but I knew every notch, every curve. My bird, the one I had given her that summer, the one she had clutched in her hand when they took her away. I let out a sound that was half sob, half gasp. For the first time in 50 years I wept. Hot, bitter tears that cut paths through the grime on my face. I held the bird in my palm, and it was as if I was holding her hand one last time. She was here, I had found her, this was her tomb. My fingers, numb and clumsy, searched the cold floor around where the bird had been, and then I felt it, a flagstone that shifted, slightly under the pressure. My heart hammered against my ribs. Using the pointed end of the crowbar, I pried at the edge. The stone lifted, revealing a small, shallow hollow carved out beneath it. And inside that hollow was a single brittle sheet of paper. Folded into a small, tight square, it was from a different kind of ledger. Not the pristine one from the lobby filled with lies, but a secret one, a true one. I carefully unfolded it, my breath held in my throat. The handwriting was Dr. Finch's, but it was different from his public script. It was spikier, impatient, stripped of all elegance. It was a list of names, and beside each name was a date, and a single chillingly bureaucratic word. Expired. It wasn't a medical term. It was the language of logistics, the word you use for a ticket, for a contract. I ran my shaking finger down the list of forgotten souls, and then I saw it, the fifth name down. Elara Vance, October 17, 1872, expired, cause complications from therapeutic hysteria. October 17th. 3 days after I had last seen her alive, the day before the snowstorm hit, the very night she had said he was going to move her. Complications from therapeutic hysteria. Not from a sickness, from the cure, from the cold baths, the starvation, the isolation, the terror. They hadn't cured her, they had killed her, and then they bricked her and all the others up in this forgotten hole and wrote them off as a business loss. I had it, the truth, a single brittle piece of paper that screamed what I had known in my bones all along. It was a hollow, terrible victory. I had not saved her, but I had found her. I had taken her back from the silence. I took the piece of paper, I took the wooden bird, and I walked out of that tomb and did not look back. I went to the state newspaper, the Vermont Phoenix. I found their most senior reporter. I laid the ledger page and the little wooden bird on his desk, and I told him my story, the story of the girl who was never there. They called him a monster then. The man they had once celebrated was now called a butcher. The story was a sensation. It ran in papers in Boston, in New York. They called for investigations. They spoke of digging up the grounds of Blackwood Manor to find the bodies. But I knew it didn't matter. The real horror wasn't Dr. Finch. He was just a man, a symptom of the disease. The true horror was the system that gave him unchecked power. The horror was a world that decided it was easier, cleaner to simply bury its problems and its sisters and its daughters than to listen to them. They never found her body. There were no graves marked with names, no bones to put to rest, but she is not lost. Her memory is not a ghost anymore. It is a story carved on a ledger page and held in the shape of a small wooden bird. And I am its keeper. My name is Elias Vance. My sister's name was Elara, and she was there.